started. Thanks for talking to your neighbor. I'll start with a brief recording that I made recently. Now, I'll give an explanation afterwards, but I want to start with the recording. One second. Should probably plug it in.
I want to thank you for being so good to me. Lord, I want to thank you for being so good to me. Lord, you woke me up this morning. Lord, you woke me right on time. I want to thank you for being so good to me.
So, what you just heard was a recording of an 86-year-old African-American senior who grew up sharecropping, and that recording was a response to my question, did you ever sing when you were growing up in the field? I asked him to sing a little bit for the interview. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about oral history in the context of agricultural transformation. The purpose of this study is to explore, understand, and describe the intergenerational lived experience of agricultural transformation among African Americans in the American South. I know that's sort of a verbose way to say it. Specifically, I mean, what has the lived experience of transitioning from sharecropping to community gardening been like among African Americans in the South? Before I talk about the research design, I just want to give a little bit of the context. I'm a practitioner I'm going to manage an urban farm at Greenleaf Learning Farm, which is a program of an after-school program in a neighborhood that's extremely limited income in Memphis. I'm also a master's student, but I'm sort of speaking as a practitioner in this context. So let me just talk a little bit about Greenleaf to give you all an understanding of where the research is taking place, and then I'll talk about the research design a little bit. So Greenleaf is a educational community garden in a so-called food desert in South Memphis, which is a historically African-American neighborhood, extremely limited income, which obscures the fact that there's many wonderful things about the neighborhood. It happens to be low income, but there's a lot of wonderful people there, and a lot of my friends live in this neighborhood. We have about 2/3 of an acre under production. There's another field across the street. We have a hoop house and raised beds, and that structure at the top left, you can just sort of see it as an outdoor classroom where we can teach classes. The program has 3 aims: food security, community development, and student education. Food security, we're selling our produce at an urban farmers market that processes SNAP. We're giving some of it away to residents who can't afford to buy anything, and then we're using it in cooking classes with our students. So with student education, the idea is for students to learn how to be healthy by learning how to grow food. So we're just sort of trying to demystify the food pyramid, the infamous food pyramid, and say, hey, if we're going to eat healthy, let's grow the food and cook it, as opposed to just letting a basket of carrots or tomatoes appear on the table and say, hey, cook this, eat this. We think that experience as a teacher and agriculture is a form of experience. So we learn by doing here. One of our students is laying drip tape in one of our fields. There's a picture of a cooking class with a couple of local chefs. And that's me and a couple of our students at the farmers market. In terms of community development, finally, we're offering small business development classes with microfinancing to locals who want to be entrepreneurs, and we're also just teaching residents how to grow food. So sort of a soft and a hard aspect, so to speak, of community development. There's a picture, photography of one of our students. So just to look briefly at the literature, I won't bore you, but in looking at the transition from a rural setting to an urban setting, as African Americans left sharecropping and moved into the city, there's no shortage of literature on that. You have economists talking about pushes and pulls in rural-urban migration experiences, forces for agricultural transformation, history and theory of sharecropping, and also mechanisms of transition to the sharecropping system. So if you're trying to look at sharecropping, there's plenty of literature on that, as I've found. There's also some literature looking at the other end of the continuum on community gardening. Bassett talks about 7 historical stages of community gardening. Lawson talks about a history of community gardening. I believe Mr. Williams quoted Glover, how community gardens produce social capital, and then as well as a couple of authors. So there is some emerging literature on the social and psychological products of community gardening. What I had not seen, and it's very possible I just haven't seen it yet, but in my knowledge, there is no empirical research on the actual lived experience of that transformation. So as a practitioner, my bias is sort of for the experience, to understand the experience in an exploratory way of what that transformation has been like. So that's sort of the motivation for this study, is to maybe make a small contribution to the literature on what that experience has actually been like. So let's have a little audience participation time. What were some of the answers that came up in your talking with neighbors about why one might want to use oral history interviews as opposed to traditional interviews or focus groups? Or does anybody have a good thought on that?
Give us a definition of the two, or what's the difference?
Oral history?
Yeah, because I thought if you'd be talking to somebody in oral history, so kind of like an interview.
Right, so did everybody hear the question? What's the difference between an oral history recording and a traditional interview? I define it as when there's a recorder, and it's not just, you're not just looking at an interview to extract specific pieces, but you're actually looking at the whole narrative, body language, and sort of all the nuanced aspects of the interview, and treating the whole narrative as a meaningful piece of data. So any thoughts on, I saw some people talking, any thoughts on why we might want to use oral history over more traditional research methods? Any brave?
Sometimes what the person has to say can take you places that you didn't anticipate. So if you go in with certain questions, you're just going to possibly leave the interview and you won't find out some of the other insights that that person might have.
Good. Yeah. Well, Valerie Yao has written very well about oral history, and I quote a little bit of her here and insert some of my own thoughts. She says that oral history research thus becomes crucial to obtaining a picture of the total society because the viewpoints of the non-elite who do not leave memoirs or have biographies are presented. So there's actually a recording of the lived experience that we otherwise might not know about. My opinion is that it empowers by indicating to people who are poor and marginalized that their voice, memory, and words are important and contain valuable insights. So not just the things to which they're referring, but actually the way in which they construct their stories and narratives is meaningful and value. And then to go back to Yao, she mentions a couple more reasons. She said, we pay attention to narratives which constitute oral history because, one, the power of narrative in general corresponds to a general way of thinking and imagining. Number two, it speaks with the voice of common sense. Number three, it invites us to consider not only the results of understanding, but to live through the processes of reaching it, which connects a little bit to what you were saying. And finally, it never tears asunder ideas and feelings. It moves us by permitting us to enter the living space of another. It is perceived as testimony. So these are some of the reasons that I've chosen to use oral history over and above, but sort of in addition to focus groups and traditional interviews. Some boring information about my methodology. I'm using snowball sampling, and 3 inclusion criteria. Respondents must be African American, have grown up in a family that's sharecropped, and presently participate in a community garden, or they do actually community garden. And then I'm going to use some software to help code and analyze the data. This study is underway, so I've interviewed a couple people and hoping to interview about 10 or 15 more, depending on the length of the transcripts and how much time I have. But my thought is that agriculture can produce effects that are socially and psychologically helpful, partly because African American seniors who participate in agriculture have a childhood experience in it. And the paradox is that it seems like growing up, those experiences were negative, were sordid. Sharecropping was a sort of just another form of slavery in a lot of ways. And yet, it was that childhood experience in agriculture that makes the modern day experience in community gardening meaningful. I remember one of these respondents said to me outside of the interview once, he said, when I look at Greenleaf, I see my childhood. And so it's interesting to me how memory works, even though maybe the emotions connected with sharecropping and community gardening have been different. So just in closing, I want to play a 2-minute excerpt from a couple of other people I've interviewed. Hopefully this time next year I'll have some more conclusive things to say, but I just wanted to share with you a little bit about what I'm working on, and hopefully I'll learn along the way. So hope you enjoy this.
Because I think when you get used to doing something, you like to do it. Like growing flowers when I was at home as a child, 12 and 13, I had to also keep the flowers in the yard. My family was tried to be the character, want to have everything looking nice. They want to have the grass cut around the house and flowers in the yard and neat property. He had character. So that's why this was ingrained in me. I like to see something growing.
But these people are trying to teach them something, and that's what I like. And the Greenleaf Learning Farm takes these young kids and get them dirty, so to speak, And I call that good dirt, good dirt, good dirt, because there is so much bad dirt around here, around here in this environment, but this is just a glimpse of light in the darkness, I would say, and it's so bright, so bright. It's almost blinded me, really, in a way.